What does it say about us as a culture? That a city as massive as New York once dimmed the lights on the Empire State Building to honor a Hollywood legend, yet for decades, never shined the same spotlight on the quiet disasters that haunted her life? We remember the scream, that one unforgettable moment on the silver screen when she clung to a skyscraper as a giant ape roared beside her. But what about the screams no camera ever caught? The ones that echoed behind closed doors, in custody hearings, and in the silence after a phone call that would change everything? Welcome back to Tragedy Uncovered. Today, we're not here to repeat the postcard version of Hollywood's golden age. We're here to dissect it, to strip away the gloss until we can see the messy, complicated truth underneath. And I promise you, the story of Fay Wray, the face of King Kong, is more than a nostalgic reel. It's a study in how triumph and tragedy can coexist so tightly. The seams are invisible until they rip apart. Make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, because what we're about to uncover will change the way you think about classic Hollywood, and maybe the way you think about fame itself. Fay Wray's story begins in the most unremarkable way. A girl from Alberta, Canada, moving with her family to the American West. No silver spoons, no early red carpets, just the slow grind of opportunity meeting ambition. By the early 1920s, Hollywood's studio system was a machine churning out faces for the screen, and Fay became one of those faces. Paramount signed her, not because she was already a star, but because they saw what the camera saw, a combination of vulnerability and defiance that could be molded into anything they needed. And in the 1930s, what they needed was fear. The industry christened her the Scream Queen, a title meant to celebrate her success in early horror films like Dr. X and Mystery of the Wax Museum. But like most labels in Hollywood, it was a velvet box with a locked lid. That scream would become her currency and her cage. Then came 1933, King Kong, the film that would stamp her name into cinema history. The footage of a giant ape atop the Empire State Building, Fay in his grip, has been replayed so many times it feels like a cultural memory, not just a movie scene. Audiences gasped, fainted, even ran out of theaters. She had become the icon everyone recognized, but not necessarily the woman anyone really knew. Away from the cameras, her life was moving on a much darker track. In 1928, she married John Monk Saunders, a celebrated screenwriter who, on paper, had the kind of success people envied. He had talent, yes, but also a growing reliance on alcohol, a string of affairs, and a controlling grip on the couple's finances. Their marriage was a study in contrasts, public glamour, private instability. By the late 1930s, the cracks were too deep to hide. They divorced in 1939, and then, the event that would burn itself into her personal history, though not in the way King Kong did for the public. Shortly after the split, Saunders took their daughter, Susan, without permission. For any parent, the fear of losing a child is primal. For Fay, it was compounded by the fact that the man she once trusted was now unpredictable, possibly dangerous. Not long after, Saunders was found dead by his own hand. The headlines treated it as Hollywood scandal, another tragic tale for the public to consume. But for Fay and her daughter, it wasn't a plot twist, it was a wound. Here's the uncomfortable question: was Saunders a villain, a victim of his own demons, or both? In an era when mental health was barely discussed and alcoholism was shrugged off as a personal failing, his behavior fit too neatly into the narrative the press loved: the tortured artist, burning too hot, too fast. But the truth is, those narratives do something dangerous. They package someone's destructive actions into a romantic tragedy, smoothing over the damage left behind. The custody fight, the fear, the betrayal, these weren't footnotes. They were the real story. If this all sounds like a grim tale, That's because it is. But it's also a mirror. We can look at the 1930s and shake our heads at the studio system. The gossip columns. The lack of compassion for those in crisis. But are we really that different now? When a celebrity implodes in public today, do we react with more empathy? Or do we just click, share, and comment until their private pain becomes our entertainment? After the custody crisis and John Monk Saunders' death, Fay did something that rarely fits the Hollywood myth. She rebuilt slowly, without spectacle. The woman who had been branded by the industry as a symbol of fear, this scream queen, went looking for something most myths forget to include: ordinary safety. That search brought her to writer-producer Robert Riskin, a man whose body of work looked nothing like the chaos she'd just endured. Riskin wasn't intoxicated by his own darkness. He was a craftsman of human-scale stories. Sincere dialogue. Moral ambiguity handled with care. Their courtship read more like an attempt at normalcy than a studio fairy tale letters. Conversations. Time. Not the montage of champagne corks and spotlights, but the small, sane gestures that, for once, didn't demand an audience. Why does this matter? Because narratives about famous women have a bad habit of moving from one extreme to another. The ingenue, the scandal, the comeback. We talk about a second chance, then immediately try to cast it as a second act, a performance. But what Fay wanted was not a role. It was a life that wouldn't turn her into a headline each time something cracked. With Riskin, she found a steadier floor. They married, made a home, and tried to live on human time instead of studio time. Yet even in calm water, there are currents. The label the industry had placed on her didn't fall off just because she had outgrown it. Typecasting is not merely a pigeonhole. It's a business model. If a studio and its advertisers could sell fear using one actress's face and voice, they had very little incentive to invest in a new image that might not convert at the box office. So Fay's portfolio in the 1940s was shaped as much by contracts and market logic as by personal choice. The machine didn't hate her. It simply couldn't see past the product it had already designed. That's the cold part of this story. Sometimes the harm isn't a villain. It's a spreadsheet. This tension between the person she was at home and the image she was paid to be at work became even sharper in 1950. Riskin suffered a debilitating stroke. Overnight, their household economy flipped. Fay, who had stepped back from the relentless climb, stepped forward again, not as a starlet chasing a billboard, but as a working professional carrying a family. The public often has a sentimental picture of coming out of retirement, as if it's a triumphant encore. The truth is less cinematic. Bills don't pause for grief. And medical care does not take payment in nostalgia. She re-entered film and television because life demanded income, consistency, and insurance, unromantic words that quietly run the world. Pause on that for a moment. How often do we talk about actresses of the studio era as caregivers and breadwinners, rather than icons and scandal subjects? Fay's return to work was a form of caregiving by another name. This is the piece that gets flattened when we reduce her to a scream on a skyscraper. Labor, love, and loyalty are not as clickable as legends, but they're a better measure of character than any poster line could ever be. Meanwhile, the press still preferred the shorthand. When someone had a neat Fay beauty, a widow, the star of a notorious film, why complicate it with nuance? Newspapers and fan magazines sold the ongoing myth because audiences bought it. That doesn't make the readers cruel. It makes them human. We are all drawn to the clean story, the satisfying arc, the version that lets us put a bow on messy realities. But clean stories are rarely honest, and the cost of dishonesty is paid by the people living the complicated parts. Fay and her daughter Susan paid that cost in privacy, in the right to move forward without everything becoming a sequel to past pain. It's worth asking, what did moving forward look like for Susan? Children caught in the wake of adult implosions rarely get narrative agency. They appear in articles as names, ages, and adjectives: missing, returned, traumatized, then disappear from the public record as if healing were automatic. That absence of detail is telling. Our media ecosystems have always been better at documenting spectacle than recovery. In the ledger of public attention, arrests and funerals out-earn therapy and quiet growth. If we're going to admire Fay's resilience, we have to factor in the invisible emotional bookkeeping that resilience requires, not only from her, but from the child who went through that storm. Back at the studio gates, the industry itself was also changing. The old contract system was loosening. Television was nibbling at film's monopoly, and audiences were learning to split their attention. In such transitions, institutions often double down on what's familiar. For someone like Fay, that meant the market still preferred her as a symbol of one particular sensation. It's easy to say, she should have reinvented herself. But reinvention isn't a solo sport. It requires gatekeepers willing to back the risk. When the appetite for something new doesn't align with the financial incentives, studios don't evolve an image, they preserve it. And the person attached to that image carries the weight. This is where Robert Riskin's presence in her life still matters. Even after illness changed everything, he represented a counterweight. A reminder that stories could be written with tenderness and complexity. That a woman's value on screen didn't have to be measured by decibels of terror. The tragedy is not that Fay never escaped her image. The tragedy is that the system around her had trouble imagining that she should. We love to celebrate individual strength, but individual strength without structural support becomes endurance noble. Yes, but also exhausting. Just to be clear, none of this turns Saunders into a cartoon antagonist or the studios into a single monolithic villain. Human beings are contradictions. Institutions are compromises. What matters is whether we can name the pressures at work without excusing the harm they enable. Saunders' talent didn't absolve his actions. The studio's efficiency didn't justify their blind spots. The press's job to tell stories didn't erase its responsibility to tell them fully. And the audience's curiosity, then as now, didn't need to be satisfied at the expense of someone's dignity. In the years after Riskin's stroke, Fay kept working. She did what lots of Americans do when life delivers the unexpected. She adapted. She provided. She kept the roof on. It's not the kind of heroism that gets statues, but it's the kind that keeps families intact. If the camera had followed her then, we wouldn't have seen a damsel in distress. We would have seen a professional managing schedules, contracts, and care plans, balancing one identity that paid the bills with another that kept a household steady. That duality is less cinematic than a giant ape, but it's more faithful to the way real lives operate under pressure. By the mid-1950s, loss returned. Riskin passed away, and the chapter that had offered Fay the most ordinary kind of hope came to an end. Yet even in grief, the public-facing narrative refused to evolve much. The posters and retrospectives still looped back to 1933, as if the decades in between were just footnotes to a single mountaintop image. There's nothing wrong with remembering greatness. The danger is forgetting that greatness is always accompanied by a ledger of costs, many of which someone else, often a woman, quietly pays. And that sets up the next turn in her story, the age of commemoration. Hollywood and the public would eventually celebrate Fay Wray with tributes, award show ovations, and even a symbolic blackout of the skyline she once scaled on film. But before we get there, we have to ask who those ceremonies are really for, and what they failed to answer about the life they claim to honor. Picking up from where we left off the threshold of commemoration, let's step inside the machinery that built the myth and managed the fallout. It's tempting to imagine one culprit, a single bad actor who pulled the strings. But the truth is more ordinary and, in a way, more unsettling. A network of incentives. People, companies, and audiences each played a role, sometimes intentionally, often just by doing what they'd always done. Start with the studios. In Fay Wray's prime, the contract system didn't just hire talent. It engineered identities. Publicists curated anecdotes. Photographers standardized poses. And marketing departments tested which emotions translated into ticket sales. Scream Queen wasn't an insult. It was a brand promise. The label told exhibitors what kind of experience to book and told audiences what kind of sensation to expect. When you hear executives talk about delivering for the market, this is what it looks like up close. Repetition that turns into a rut. Once a persona sells, it hardens. If you're the face of terror, the system keeps handing you fear. Add the press. Fan magazines and gossip columns weren't purely predatory. Many were symbiotic partners who kept the star system humming. They offered fans a stable storyline, rags to riches. Love found, trouble faced, harmony restored. But their appetite for tidy arcs came with a blind spot. Complexity didn't headline as well as certainty. When Fay's first marriage crumbled, coverage drifted toward a familiar morality tale. The brilliant but troubled writer. The beautiful actress. A relationship undone by vice. It's not that the summary was false. It's that it was too clean. Once you decide on a motif, tortured genius, long-suffering muse, you stop asking harder questions about responsibility, prevention, and repair. Move to the creatives around King Kong, the men whose vision launched Fay's most famous performance. They weren't villains either. They were pioneers pushing film language forward. Their imagery etched itself into the public imagination and gave a city a skyline-sized symbol to rally around. But even that achievement came with collateral effects for the woman at its center. Innovation tends to freeze-frame the people who help deliver it. Once a moment becomes iconic, it competes with every subsequent chapter of a life. No matter how nuanced Fay's later roles were, the shadow of a giant ape followed her into retrospectives, clip reels, and casual conversation. That's the paradox of being a symbol. You gain longevity. You lose dimensionality. Then there are the audience's millions of people, mostly well-meaning, whose collective decisions create a market signal. When viewers bought tickets to see Fay terrified, the message returned to the studio was clear: more of that. Decades later, when television reruns and nostalgia programming reintroduced King Kong to new generations, the loop tightened. Cultural memory worked like an algorithm before algorithms. Clicks replaced by ratings. Impressions replaced by box office. But the feedback logic was the same. The more one thing performs, the more often it's delivered, the more it crowds out other possibilities. Lost inside that circuitry were two people who didn't fit any profitable storyline: Fay as a mother and Susan as a child. When John Monk Saunders took their daughter after the divorce, most coverage framed it as a shocking episode in a larger Hollywood tragedy, not a case study in custody, safety, and recovery. We rarely ask how a child processes publicized fear, or how a mother rebuilds trust after that breach. Those questions don't sell issues, and yet they're the only ones that tell you what kind of support the family needed, and whether any of it arrived. Now Fold and Robert Riskin, the counterexample in this web. His writing championed decency without turning saccharine, complexity without crushing hope. In many ways, he was the anti-myth, a craftsman whose fame rested on the craft, not on personal turmoil. His partnership with Fay offered a different kind of narrative, one grounded in steadiness and mutual respect. When illness struck, the story's center shifted to care work, a form of heroism that looks nothing like a movie climax. The studio system had clear lanes for star-making and scandal management. It had no playbook for honoring the dignity of care. That's why this chapter in Fay's life, though morally important, was commercially quiet. This is where commemoration enters with its own contradictions. Years later, as Hollywood developed a more formal language of honoring its past award show montages, lifetime tributes, museum exhibits, Fay Wray's image re-emerged as an emblem of a golden era. Standing ovations recognized her legacy. Directors sent invitations for cameos. Landmarks went dark for a few minutes in a city that rarely dims for anything. These gestures mattered. They signaled respect and gratitude. But do they resolve the structural problems that shaped her life? Not really. Tribute is not therapy. Applause is not accountability. Consider how those ceremonies are staged. We dim lights. We play clips. We narrate the arc from obscurity to immortality. We don't pause to interrogate the economics and power structures that limited a performer's range, or the social norms that made addiction a private shame instead of a public health issue, or the legal systems that failed to center the child in a custody catastrophe. To be fair, that's not what tributes are designed to do. They sanctify. They don't diagnose. But if we're going to tell a fuller story, we have to do both. Honor the work and audit the context. Let's test a few of the comfortable myths. Myth 1. Raw talent always finds a way out of the box. Reality. Talent needs gatekeepers willing to risk money on reinvention. And those gatekeepers answer to balance sheets. Myth 2. The press merely reflects public interest. Reality. Press decisions shape interest by choosing which narratives to amplify and which to bury. Myth 3. Time heals all wounds. Reality. Time only hides the complicated parts from view. What isn't named isn't healed. Even the debate over personal responsibility versus systemic failure can be sharpened. John Monk Saunders was responsible for his actions. Recognizing the role addiction and mental health played is not the same as absolving harm. Studios were responsible for their business choices. Acknowledging market pressures doesn't erase the human costs of creative tunnel vision. Audiences are responsible for their appetites. Admitting curiosity doesn't require indulging in cruelty. Responsibility isn't a hot potato to pass around until nobody's holding it. It's a shared weight distributed across the network that benefited from the spectacle and absorbed almost none of the consequences. So what would a more ethical ecosystem look like if we rewound the tape? In a better world, a star branded as a scream queen could pitch and receive roles that don't rely on scream or queen. A powerful writer facing addiction would meet a system that intervenes early contract clauses tied to treatment. Unions equipped with real resources. Studios incentivized to protect, not just produce. Tabloids would still tell stories, but with lines they won't cross when children are involved. And when commemoration comes, it would include a kind of institutional learning. Here's what we got right. Here's what we got wrong. Here's how we changed because of it. If that sounds idealistic, consider how much effort we already spend preserving props, posters, and set pieces from classic films. We know how to save objects. We're less practiced at saving lessons. Fay Wray's career gave us unforgettable images. Her private life, its fractures, its responsibilities, its unpaid labor gives us something rarer, a chance to calibrate what we celebrate and what we ignore. The network that made her famous is the same network that struggled to see her fully. Looking at that network clearly isn't an attack on a beloved era. It's a sign that we finally know how to love its icons without flattening the people they were. So if the ecosystem that made Fay Wray both famous and flat is now visible, the next fair move is to press on the seams that still haven't been fully opened. Not for the thrill of revelation, but for the kind of clarity that helps us stop repeating the same patterns with different names. Some questions are historical. Others could be asked of today's headlines without changing a syllable. Take the financial control inside Fay's first marriage. We know that John Monk Saunders was brilliant and volatile, that his dependence on alcohol grew, and that he tightened his grip on money. But control is a vague word. Was it household budgeting shaped by the gender norms of the era? Or was it economic coercion, limits on access, surveillance of spending, punishment dressed up as prudence? The public story treats finance as a subplot, yet in most households money is power in its cleanest, coldest form. Stardom gave Fay a paycheck. A partner's leverage could translate that paycheck into insecurity. Our record of glamorous parties and studio memos is much fuller than our record of bank ledgers and spousal agreements. That imbalance, even in hindsight, keeps us from measuring how much of her agency was outsourced to someone else's choices. Then the legal question, after the divorce, when Saunders took their daughter, what exactly did the custody terms look like? The headlines treat the episode as a burst of chaos, theft, abduction, the language of a crime blotter, but the law is slower and more boring than a headline. Did the courts have protocols for a public figure whose private conflict was becoming news? Were there safeguards for a child whose name had been made legible to millions? It's easy to tell a story in which one person acts out and the system responds. It's harder and more honest to ask whether the system was designed to protect the most vulnerable party, or merely to process the mess with minimal liability. Replace the year 1939 with any year you recognize, and the question holds: are custody frameworks built around children, or are they refurbished battlefields for adults? Mental health sits at the center of another blank space. When we say a person was troubled, are we describing a treatable set of conditions? Or are we using a polite word to buffer ourselves from the discomfort of specifics? Alcoholism, depression, and suicidal ideation were not just misfortunes. They were untreated emergencies. The studio system could orchestrate an image launch in a week. But where was the emergency plan for a crisis eating a household from the inside? Studio contracts were excellent at protecting production schedules. Were they designed to protect people when the person was the product? If a writer or actor spiraled, who called the doctor? Who paid? Who followed up? When an industry optimizes for delivery and not for durability, human beings become consumables, valuable, then expensive, then replaceable. Let's run a parallel track on image labor. When we debate typecasting, we often treat it like a creative inconveniency, an artist bored by repetitive roles. But the economics of typecasting extract something intimate: a person's reflexes and physiology turned into inventory. If a market is trained to pay for your frightened face, the market will ask for that face again and again, even as your life demands very different performances. Mother, caregiver, widow, worker. How much of Fay's time, post 1933, was spent negotiating the gap between the life she needed and the sensation the system wanted to buy? Negotiation is work. Saying no is work. Looking for different scripts is work. It all consumes the same energy that grief and healing require. When we celebrate the grit of classic stars, are we admiring strength or normalizing an unnecessary drain? Now fold in the press. Because coverage isn't neutral gravity, it tilts the field. Reporters in the studio era were often fed a diet of curated facts and carefully framed anecdotes. Many played along, and many resisted. But even resistance was hemmed in by the audience's appetite for coherence. That's the quiet engine beneath sensationalism: demand for a story that feels finished. The problem is that lives rarely satisfy that demand on cue. When Saunders died by his own hand, a mythology snapped into place. The tragic arc ended cleanly, and the audience didn't have to sit with the sprawl of aftermath. It's no accident that the most complicated chapters, custody, trauma, recovery, are also the most underreported. Complexity doesn't close. It lingers. Linger long enough, and you become yesterday's news. What about commemoration? We've talked about its beauty and its limits. But there's another angle. Who gets to design the ceremony? And what gets left out by design? A blackout on a skyscraper is a powerful symbol. But symbols have edges. They can hold grief. They struggle to hold contradiction. A tribute can say, "Thank you," without learning to say, "We learned." Was there ever a moment in the ritualized memory of Fay Wray, when the industry publicly acknowledged the structural mistakes that funneled her into a narrow lane and the absence of guardrails when her family was in distress? We have a cultural script for honoring pioneers. We have a thin script for auditing the conditions we created around them. Now let's jump to the present, where social media has turned the old feedback loop into a live wire. We talk about algorithms as if they're weather, but they're just mirrors with incentives. If you respond most intensely to the spectacle of someone's collapse, the system will prioritize collapses. If you linger on a clip of a celebrity crying or lashing out or breaking down, that lingering becomes a vote for more of the same. It's not that users are malicious. Curiosity is human, but attention is capital, and platforms spend it where the return is highest. Swap film exhibitors for recommendation engines, and the pattern stays intact. What performs crowds out what heals. This is where the story of Fay and Susan casts a long, instructive shadow. A child moved through danger. A mother paid a lifetime's worth of private costs. And the public kept the most photogenic frame. If we're honest, a similar dynamic unfolds every time a family in crisis becomes headline material today. We follow the twist. We debate guilt and sympathy in the comments. And then we drift to the next plot when the news cycle turns. The people living the story don't get to drift. They live in the aftermath we stopped watching. We might congratulate ourselves on being more open about mental health now. And in many ways we are. But openness without infrastructure is just vocabulary. Who funds the care? Who protects children from being drafted into a narrative they can't vote on? Who limits the recycling of personal pain into endless monetizable content? Consider also the way nostalgia can anesthetize critical thinking. When we press play on a restored print of King Kong, it's easy to feel that everything attached to that image belongs to a safer, simpler past. The restoration of film stock becomes a restoration of memory. But celluloid clarity doesn't equal moral clarity. The artifact is sharper because technology improved. The story is clearer only if we do the labor. If anything, the crispness should force harder questions. What structures produced this beauty? What structures ignored the human cost? What would it take to keep the former and retire the latter? Finally, a practical note about how we, as consumers, cause or reduce harm. You don't have to become a media ethicist to change the incentives. Slow down before you share. Read beyond the first interpretation. When you hear a simplistic arc genius, scandal, redemption, ask who benefits from keeping it simple. When a tribute lands perfectly on your emotions, ask what it omitted to land that cleanly. The point isn't to become cynical. It's to become accurate. Fay Wray's life deserves the accuracy we often reserve for box office numbers and awards lists. Accuracy, in stories like hers, is a kind of respect. It names what happened and what helped it happen. It sees the person, not just the picture. Start with the most comforting chorus, the celebratory camp. This group keeps the spotlight squarely on Fay Wray's cinematic impact, her poise under impossible staging, her timing with practical effects, her ability to sell fear without shrinking into caricature. For them, the point of revisiting her career is to preserve joy, the thrill of a monster movie that taught audiences what spectacle could do. They point to standing ovations, remastered releases, and the respectful silence of a skyline as proof that culture can express gratitude. In their frame, emphasizing personal pain feels like turning a eulogy into a deposition. Why desecrate the shrine to revisit the crime scene? Opposite that is the skepticism camp, which argues that the shrine is the problem. They don't deny Fay's artistic contribution. They insist that ignoring the costs makes the contribution incomplete. This camp believes that canon building without context is a luxury of those who weren't harmed. They press questions about how the studio machine typecast her, how the press flattened her, and how addiction and custody were handled. They're not anti-nostalgia. They're anti-amnesia. For them, the blackout tribute on a landmark is meaningful but insufficient beautiful choreography around unresolved obligations. There's a third camp we often overlook, the move-on middle. These are viewers who feel squeezed by both extremes. They're tired of culture wars and wary of retroactive judgment. They want room to love the films that shaped their childhoods without feeling like accomplices to historical harm. And they want to acknowledge that harm without becoming permanent jurors for events they didn't witness. Their instinct is to compartmentalize art in one box, biography in another. It's a defensible coping strategy, but it breaks down the moment the two boxes share a hinge switch. With Fay, they do. The brand that made the art valuable also constrained the person who made it. The debate gets even louder when we zoom in on personal responsibility. Some voices insist the story should be read mostly through human choice. Saunders made choices. Studios made choices. Journalists made choices. Audiences made choices. Another set pushes structure to the fore. The incentives were misaligned. Guardrails were missing. Healthcare and labor frameworks failed. Patriarchal norms made economic coercion legible and acceptable. In reality, these aren't opposing explanations, three layers. Choice operates inside structure. Structure conditions choice. Reducing the story to one layer is tidy. Keeping both in view is honest. Media scholars and ethicists add yet another register, the question of dignity costs. Every time a private crisis is converted into public narrative, someone pays a dignity tax. Sometimes it's the price of accountability. Sometimes it's exploitation dressed as accountability. The studio-era press made these calls quickly, and often competitively. Today, the calculus is crowdsourced at the speed of a push notification. A police report becomes a trending topic. A court filing is parsed on livestream. A terrified parent is gift. When a story like Fay's resurfaces in retrospectives or in anniversary coverage, we inherit the bill. The dignified version of commemoration requires us to factor in how much privacy was spent to make the legend possible. So what does responsible coverage look like in practice? First, proportion. When we mention the custody crisis, we center the child's safety and long-term outcomes, not just the drama of the abduction. Second, precision. Troubled may be a start, but it should lead to specifics about mental health and addiction treatment access in the period, not in with a euphemism that blurs accountability. Third, parity. We extend to historical figures the same nuance we demand for contemporary ones, the capacity to be brilliant and harmful, beloved and blinkered. More than an angle, the goal is neither sanctification nor demolition. It's calibration. That word calibration matters in the debate over typecasting as well. Defenders of the studio era sometimes argue that everyone was typecast. It was simply the grammar of the system. True enough, but the grammar didn't parse men and women the same way. For male stars, type often meant ideals, heroism, wit, stoicism that could stretch into prestige roles. For women, type more often meant reaction, scream, sigh, sparkle that were harder to promote into three-dimensional characters without a deliberate intervention. When the intervention didn't come, the type hardened into a ceiling. Fay Wray managed to infuse that ceiling with intelligence and wit anyway. That's a testament to her skill. It's not a defense of the ceiling. Public reaction over time also reveals how rituals can drift from meaning to muscle memory. The ovation at a major award show is powerful the first time. By the 10th recycled clip, it risks becoming a reflex applause on autopilot. Landmarks going dark can be solemn and moving. Repeated too often and without reflection, the act can blur into decorative grief. None of this argues against tribute. It argues for context around tribute, a sentence or two that says what we learned, what changed, what we owe the next generation of performers who might face the same pressures under new names branding. Franchising. Virality. Another angle that sparks debate is the cameo question late in life when a director offers a revered actress a small role to honor her legacy. On paper, it's affectionate. In practice, it can feel like requesting permission to borrow someone's history for your marketing. Declining such offers is sometimes framed as ingratitude. It might just be the last exercise of narrative self-determination. If your most famous image has already been excerpted for a century, you're allowed to decide how, or if, you appear in a new chapter written by someone else. The social layer complicates all of this further. Online, you'll see threads that weaponize Fay's story to score points in contemporary culture battles. Proof that old Hollywood was predatory. Proof that cancel culture is unfair. Proof that the media always lies. Proof that the media finally tells the truth. The same facts are drafted into opposite arguments. That should be a warning light. When a narrative functions equally well as ammo for every side, we've probably lost contact with the specifics. The antidote is disciplined attention, timelines that don't cheat, quotes that aren't decontextualized, comparisons that clarify rather than inflame. Finally, there's the quiet constituency that never trends people who find in Fay's life a personal instruction manual for survival. Caregivers recognize the pivot she made when illness hit her family. Children of addiction recognize the instability that bends a household's calendar around someone else's crisis. Professionals recognize the grind of working within a label you didn't choose. These viewers don't need an anniversary or a restored print to understand what's at stake. They're already living versions of the same math. How to balance compassion with boundaries. How to honor a past without being ruled by it. How to keep earning a living inside systems that weren't built with your wholeness in mind. All of which brings us back to the question of what a culture owes its icons beyond applause. Not just a plaque, not just a montage, but a habit of telling the truth with care. When we argue about Fay Wray what to emphasize, what to omit, we are really arguing about our standards for memory. Do we want memory that flatters, or memory that steadies us for the next hard choice? The answer will decide whether the next person forced into a one-word brand finds a path out or just a longer shadow to live under. Start with a simple discipline, chronology with compassion. Timelines are not just lists of dates. They are guardrails against manipulation. In Fay's story, the order matters: the rise of a studio image, the erosion of a marriage, the custody crisis, the new partnership, the sudden illness, the long stretch of caregiving, and finally the rituals of remembrance. When we keep that order steady, we prevent the most dramatic moment from swallowing everything else. Chronology rejects the impulse to treat the abduction and the suicide as the truth, while the caregiving years are treated as filler. If a life is a house, then chronology forces us to walk every room, not just the one with the shattered glass. Next, we need a sharper vocabulary for harm. Troubled and rocky are words that make readers comfortable. They also dull the edges of reality. Economic coercion inside a marriage is not a rough patch. Addiction without treatment is not bad luck. A child removed without consent is not family drama. Words that minimize harm distort responsibility and, in the long run, normalize repetition. The point is not to sensationalize. It's to name things cleanly enough that prevention becomes legible. If the studio era had possessed that vocabulary and the will to back it with policy, some of the damage we discussed today might have been interrupted in real time instead of archived in sorrow. That moves us to infrastructure. It's fashionable to say mental health matters. And it does. But slogans without systems are theater. In any field that monetizes performance film then. Social media, now the incentives are misaligned. Production is rewarded. Recovery is not. The fix is boring and therefore powerful. Contracts with treatment clauses that protect jobs during crisis. Guild funds earmarked for dependents. On-call clinicians who answer to medical ethics. Not publicity departments. Training for managers and publicists to de-escalate rather than to disguise. None of this turns a human tragedy into a solvable equation. It does, however, convert some risks from inevitable to interruptible. Typecasting deserves that same infrastructure approach. We tend to preach reinvention as a matter of personal grit. Try harder. Say no. Find different scripts. But reinvention is a supply problem as much as a demand problem. If a performer has been packaged as a single sensation and the market has been trained to expect it, then the pipeline must be deliberately widened. That means development money for roles that stretch the frame. Critics willing to review the stretch on its own terms. And audiences willing to pay for a version of the performer that doesn't trigger the old reflex. Otherwise, reinvention is just a polite way of telling the artist to swim upstream while we cheer from shore. On the media side, there's a repair we can make immediately: proportionality and privacy for minors. When a story contains a child, the editorial center of gravity should shift by default. That doesn't require censorship. It requires restraint, blurring identifiers when possible, refusing sensational descriptors, focusing coverage on safety, process, and outcomes rather than on voyeuristic detail. Imagine if the reporting around Susan had followed that rule. The public would have learned what it needed to know about risk and response. And a child would have been spared a portion of the spotlight she never asked to stand in. Commemoration can be upgraded too, without losing its beauty. It's not sacrilege to pair a tribute with a footnote of learning. The lights go down. The clip plays. The crowd rises, and then a single sentence names the lesson we carry forward. For Fay Wray, that might sound like, we honor a pioneer who taught cinema how to feel scale. And we commit to protecting the people whose bodies and voices carry our myths. That one line links memory to maintenance. It keeps the tribute from floating away like a balloon. For audiences, the most potent tool is attention with friction. Before we share, we pause. Before we react, we check sequence and source. Before we crown a villain or a saint, we ask what this certainty makes us overlook. None of this requires a graduate seminar. It's a household ethic. The same way most of us already refuse to forward medical rumors or clickbait about people we know. Apply that instinct to public figures, and the incentive field around them begins to move. Platforms cannot thrive on dignified restraint if nobody practices it. They can and will adapt if enough of us do. There's also the matter of how we carry icons in our private imaginations. A classic image feels like a finished object. Fay Wray in the grip of the ape. Wind tearing at her dress. Terror calibrated to the rhythm of a composer's score. But if we reduce a person to their most famous still, we forfeit the more demanding, more human act of recognition. Recognition says, I see the worker behind the work, the caregiver behind the credits, the parent behind the publicity still. It allows two truths to sit side by side without forcing a winner. Fay Wray could be the artist who convinced a generation to believe a fantasy and the woman who shouldered duty when the cameras were gone. Keeping both truths in frame is not a burden. It's an upgrade to our empathy. We should also talk about what we owe the future Susan in every story now unfolding. She doesn't read the news about herself yet. She doesn't vote in the comments. She can't negotiate the terms of her portrayal. But one day she will search her name. She will see how we decided to frame her role in an adult disaster. She will learn what we thought mattered. Craft your coverage and your consumption with that search in mind. Let the person who eventually finds your words discover context, not collateral damage. And finally, there's the quiet recalibration that happens when we stop expecting a perfect ending. In a movie, the lights signal closure. In a life, closure is rare. Fay Wray didn't get a neat moral. She got chapters, some luminous, some heavy, all unfinished in the honest sense. If we can be satisfied with an ending that remains open and ending that honors achievement, names harm, and chooses restraint where curiosity wants to gorge, we'll have done something radical for a culture addicted to complete stories. We will have left room for the living to continue living. That, more than any slogan or statue, is the tribute that lasts, a public that remembers vividly, speaks precisely, intervenes early, and resists the urge to turn a person into a perpetual plotline. The scream that made Fay Wray famous was a cinematic instrument. The silence that followed it was a human right. Keeping both in tune is the work. Here's the hardest truth to sit with. Not every silence hides a conspiracy, and not every open wound yields a clean lesson. Fay Wray's life reminds us that greatness and damage can live under the same roof. That a single iconic image can light a skyline while leaving the rooms behind it in shadow. The question that lingers isn't, who should we blame? But, what kind of audience do we want to be next time? The difference between those two questions is the difference between curiosity that consumes and attention that cares. Maybe the most responsible ending is no ending at all, just a pause long enough to let the aftershocks be heard. When we look back at the scream that made her famous, can we also make space for the unfilmed years that required courage with no applause? When the clip plays again, will we remember the worker behind the work, the parent behind the poster, the person behind the persona? And when the next public crisis arrives in our feeds, will we choose restraint over refresh? Thank you for staying with us until the very end. Subscribe to Tragedy Uncovered so you won't miss any hidden truths. Goodbye, and see you next time.